Okay, I want to welcome everybody to Lane Motor Museum. I'm Jeff Lane, and today I'm going to talk about this exhibit that we put together, which is called the Director's Cut. This exhibit kind of came about last November when we were setting up our exhibits for the year. David Yando, our manager, said, you know, what I would really like to see in this exhibit is pick out some of your favorite cars out of the collection and why you like those cars. And I said, yeah, no problem, that's easy, I'll do it. So I went through the car list, you know, in my office, and I marked down, you know, cars that I really liked, and I got to about 25. And I thought, well, I'm gonna have to weed that down a little bit. And then I walked around the museum in the basement and I added 5 more to that, so I was up to 30. And I thought, well, I'm really gonna have to weed that down. But through time, I did weed it down. It was at first I thought it'd be very easy. But in the end, it was really difficult because it was like, well, you know, I really like this car, but then there's this car. But in the end, these are the 9 cars that I chose that are right here. I want to talk a little bit about each car and why I picked each car. I'm going to start with the 1959 Scooter car. I picked this car, one, because it's kind of outrageously looking, and it has an outrageous story about how it came to be a car. Scooter cars was started by Henslet Engineering in Leeds, England, manufactured railway locomotives. And one of their directors' wives drove a Jag XK120, which was a high-end sports car at that time. But when she got into urban areas, she always had trouble parking it because of the congestion. She couldn't find a big enough spot and everything like that. So she comes home to her husband one night and says, you know, could you make a car that would be easy for me to park? And the directors, they started talking about that, and they said, yeah, we do railway locomotives, but you know, if we do that, we could do a microcar. So they started another little company called Scooter Car and decided to build this car. Now, it seems like just an odd thing to go from railway engines to this. Obviously, it continued to make railway locomotives because that was their main business. But so next they got into the design of the car, how they wanted to design it. And so the designers decided that they wanted to use a Villars single-cylinder 197cc motorcycle engine, be real easy to obtain, they'd be cheap to get. So they got an engine and transmission. Next they decided what they wanted to do is they built a box, put the motor inside the box, and then they had a person sit on the box, and then they sculpted the body around the person, which you can kind of see when you look at this car. That's how it came about. It had a nickname of the telephone booth, is what it was. So that's how the car came about. They made about 750. This is the Mark I. They also made a Mark II, which over there against the wall, there's a blue Mark II. They weren't very successful. They didn't sell in large volume, but actually it was a pretty well done car. But another very interesting thing about the Mark I is in 1960, a guy, an Englishman named Peter Mott, decided he wanted to drive a scooter car from London to Istanbul, Turkey, which was about 1,000 miles. And you also have to consider the roads once you got into Turkey at that time would have been terrible. Not only did he want to drive it, he wanted to take his wife and his camping gear. And he did that. It's actually touted as a 3-seater. You have one bench here in the middle, and then you have a seat in the back where supposedly one person sits on each side of you, one fairly small person. So they went to Istanbul with their camping gear and his wife. I'm sure he wrote a book about it, and it's a very good book. It's called Road to Istanbul. But not surprisingly, when they got there, his wife decided she's taking the train back to London. She wasn't going to drive the car. So she took the train back to London. He didn't get out of Turkey before he apparently was T-boned by a bicycle, and it did severe damage to the car. And so at that point, he wanted to kind of give up, just leave the car there and go back to London. But the problem he had was in Turkey at that time, the import tax on a car was 50% or more. So if you bought a new car in Turkey and it was made outside of Turkey, which almost every car was, you had to pay a 50% tax. So what they didn't want is people to drive cars into Turkey to visit their friends and then leave by train and leave the car. So they had very strict border controls. When you came in, they took down your license plate number, your name, where you lived, when the car came in, how long you expected to be there, and they really checked to make sure the car was going to leave. And so the policeman came to the accident scene and he was writing a ticket up and everything. And Peter Mott was saying, you know, I really just want to leave the car, I want to scrap the car, and I want to go home. And the policeman saying, no, you can't do that because of the import laws. The car, you know, was imported here, and you have to take it back out of the country. And he's like, well, it's severely damaged, and I can't drive it. and now I don't know how I'm going to get it out of the country. So he kind of was pleading with him and talking with him, and finally the policeman said, look, if you turn around, I'll turn around for about a minute, and if you're gone, I'll just write up as, I don't know what happened. I showed up and here's his smashed car, I don't know how it got here and everything. And that's what happened, is he left the car, he took the train home. So it's really a fascinating story. You know, this car, it looks very weird because it's so tall. It actually drives quite well. It goes about 50 miles an hour. It's fairly stable. It's not super fast, but it's fairly stable. And one of the good things about it is, when they built it, is you sit up pretty high in this car. When you sit inside it, you're up high. So when you pull up to another regular car on the road, you're basically still about the same height they are. Like a lot of microcars, the Messerschmitt, you're sitting really, really low, and you pull up to another regular car, and you look out and you see their door handle, or if you look in an SUV, you see the bottom of their door, so you really feel small. So in this car, you feel fairly high, so it feels fairly good in terms of driving it. One of the big problems with it is the motor is right under the seat that you sit on. And so there's a lot of vibration, and there's a lot of noise. And it's all, this has plastic windows, which we took out because we never use them, but when you're inside it, it's like this tin can going ding, 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 ding. And when you're driving on the road now, you'll stop at a stoplight and everybody wants to come up and say, hey, what is that? You know, how are you driving that car? And you can't hear anything. You can't hear, you know, you stick your head out the window and you can kind of hear a little bit, but you can't hear much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start it up, and hopefully it'll start. It started an hour ago. And you can come over here and kind of stick your head in the window, and you can kind of get a feeling for how loud it is, because it's really kind of amazing. So. So if you want to come over here and kind of, you can just kind of stick your head in here. It's a little smoky too, but that gives you a good idea how, and that's at idle. Obviously driving down the road, it's a lot louder than that inside. So next I'm going to go to my next pick, which is a Honda Life van. In Japan, they have what they call a K-Class. And then they had it back then. They still have the K-Class now. And what the K-Class is in Japan, if you don't own a garage or a parking space, if you live in an apartment on the road, you have to buy a K-Class car. You can't just buy anything because you don't have a place to park it. And so they make you buy a small car. The original K-Class car, the length was limited to about 3 meters. The width was limited to the width of this car, and the engine size was limited to 360 cc's. They since have raised the limit of the engine up to 600 cc's, but the dimensions haven't changed. So this is a minivan that Honda built in the 70s. The reason I like this is with 360 cc's, the engine's smaller than most people's push lawnmower. It actually will go 60 miles an hour. I've driven it on the freeway. It won't go 60 miles an hour up any kind of hill. But it's just amazing that it'll go that fast. And on top of that, it's just the packaging and everything is really well, and it's hard to believe that a vehicle this small, you know, a regular sized person really can get in it, and it's really pretty roomy. It doesn't really feel like you're in a tiny van. I know Chrysler thought that they invented the minivan back in the 80s, but obviously Honda did it in the 70s, and we'll see Fiat did it even earlier than that. So it's just, it's really an amazing little car. It handles good, it's fun to drive, and it's another car like this. When you're driving on the road, everybody is looking at, because it looks so tiny. I mean, it just looks absolutely tiny compared, well, it is tiny compared to everything else that's on the road now. So the next car I'm going to talk about is a Fiat Multipla. It's kind of, you know, who knows what the first minivan is, but it's kind of what I call a minivan. Made in Italy. The Fiat 500, the white car over here, actually was the people's car of Italy in the 50s and 60s. This was the van version of it, so if you had a larger family, you could buy a van and still get everybody in the same vehicle. A lot of people use these for delivery vehicles. It's actually a 6-seater. It's got 2 sets of bench seats behind the front seat, which in about 15 seconds folds down flat into nothing. So if you want to carry something, that works very well. This was a really successful vehicle. They sold over 160,000 in the 10-year production. And again, I like it because ergonomically and engineering-wise, it was a perfect hit. I mean, it's perfectly packaged. Again, and today, you can drive it on the freeway, it goes 60. It's easy to drive, but not only that, because the engine's in the back, it's really, really quiet. There's no noise except the wind noise, and the motor's not real loud anyway, but it's all behind you. The heat's all behind you. So it's really a pleasant car to drive. It's one of those cars I've driven a lot, but one day I was leaving here to go to lunch, and I turned right on Murfreesboro Road, and I was driving another car. And I saw this right in front of me, and so I knew it was a couple of the restoration technicians probably out goofing around. No, they were going to lunch. But anyway, when you drive, you don't realize how narrow it is, but when you get up behind it, it's like, wow, that car is like half the width of everything else. It's another kind of narrow, tall car. And it looks, from inside, you don't really get that perspective, but when you see it from the outside, it's very different. So. And Fiat, it was such a successful car that Fiat, back in the mid-90s, they brought the Multipla name back and started making minivans again until the year 2010. So it really, really had a long life. And if you know, it's got doors on both sides, and as you can see, if you want to come over and take a look, you can see how simple the seating is. And the doors are huge. I mean, it's easy to get in and out no matter how you are. And if you want to flip the seats down, you just, that's how long it takes to flip down to a flat bed on each side. I mean, it's just really simple, really functional, and just really well done. All right, next I want to go to, this is a 1959 Citroen ID 19. The ID was introduced in the Paris Auto Show in 1955. And needless to say, it was a sensation because prior to that, the Traction Avant was the car that Citroen made for 20 years, kind of a stodgy looking regular car, like every other car. And all of a sudden, the ID comes out and it looks like a spaceship. And that's why I like the ID, is not just that it looks like a spaceship, but it was technologically also a marvel because, one, they wanted to make it very aerodynamic, which they did with the shape. It actually has a totally flat bottom. But it also has a tremendous amount of interesting features. It's front-wheel drive, it's 4-cylinder, but the most interesting thing about it was the suspension is all hydraulic. It's hydraulic and pneumatic. So when you start the car up, there's a pump, and the car raises up, and that's the suspension. It doesn't have any springs. It has different ride heights. It has a medium ride height for most anywhere. It has a low ride height for if you're driving very fast and you want the car to be more aerodynamic. If you're on a really rough road, it has a higher ride height. So you can do that all by a lever inside the cockpit. The other interesting thing about the car is it's super, super comfortable. People sit in it and it's like, oh, it feels like a couch. It feels like my couch. The floor mats are that thick. We give rides in it now, and you got to consider this car's 60 years old now. It's 60-year-old technology. And it rides better than almost any modern car. With the hydropneumatic suspension and the seats, it's incredible. And if you want to come around and sit in it, because people really, they just can't believe how comfortable it is. So if you'd like to come around and take a seat, anybody? But one of the other neat features about this car, and they didn't design this into the car, but after they designed the car, they realized with the pneumatic system, we don't need a jack if we have a flat tire. All we need to do is raise the car up to a high level, and then you put a rod underneath this side of the car or that side of the car, and then you let the level go all the way back down, and you have this side, if you did this side, you would have this side of the car off the ground. And so there wasn't a need for a jack. Oh, it's beautiful. So in a second here, I'm going to go ahead and start it up, raise it up, and show you how you can bring the side up. And another thing Citroen did, and they were the pioneers in this, if you notice the steering wheel has one spoke. And that wasn't just for looks. They actually did tests, because this is before seatbelts, of when you have a crash and you end up running your chest into the steering wheel. They wanted to make the steering wheel so it would collapse and hopefully not hurt you as bad. But not only did they do a single spoke, they did tests to find out where should the spoke be at? You know, most accidents happen when you're going straight ahead. Not always, but they had statistics that 80% of accidents happen like that. So should the spoke be here? Should it be here? Should it be there? And they did tests on where it was the best position to have the spoke to make it safest for the driver. So I'm going to go ahead and start it up, and I'll raise it up and show you how you can put the rod in it. I can see it coming up. So that height there is normal ride height. So if you bring it all the way up like that, it takes a minute for it to come up. And then you bring it back down. Well, I might not have gotten it up high enough, huh? Oh, I don't think I did. Let me see if I can get it all the way up. Oh, there, it's one more notch. Takes a minute, but it's easier than a jack. Oop. Well, maybe it's not going to do it. It's not going all the way up. Back to the restoration shop on Monday. No. Let's see if it'll. Is it coming up now? Yeah, there you can see the back wheels off the ground. Maybe they are off the ground just enough. Yeah, this one's not. The back one's off, but it's not quite right on the front. But a friend of mine had one of these in the 70s in Nashville, and he would go to a full-serve gas station, and as the attendant's putting the gas in it, the gas filler's back on the other side, he would run the car up and down and look in the rearview mirror to see the attendants like, is this car moving or what, you know? So, okay, the next car is another Citroen, the SM. This was their sports car. So they came out with a hydraulic suspension and all the great features of this car, and in the late 60s, they said, we want to take all this technology and we want to build a sports car. And so they built the SM. Unfortunately, it came out in 1970, just about the time that the fuel crisis hit. So they were $12,000, huge amount of money back then. And although this car got great economy, if you drove this car fast, this was 12 miles per gallon. Has a V6 Maserati engine, 180 horsepower. Again, very, very comfortable, very, very well done car. Where this car was very successful, sold 1,400,000 units. This car only lasted 5 years before it went out of production. They only sold about 12,000 cars. Part of it was the fuel crisis, but a lot of it too, the price was just exorbitant, and people just couldn't afford it. But, you know, the hood's all aluminum, all the bumpers and the trim, it's not chromed, it's all stainless. I mean, they didn't bear any expense on this car. You can see it's front-wheel drive, just like the ID, but you can kind of see how they packed in the V6 Maserati engine. But also you can see this was an extremely complicated car, and it was very difficult to maintain. Okay, my next favorite car is this 61 DKW 1000. It's a two-stroke front-wheel drive car made in Germany. DKW was one brand of Auto Union. You see the four rings, which is now Audi. Back at this time, there were four brands. There was Audi, there was DKW, Wanderer, and Horsch. Wanderer and Horsch were both very high-end cars. Audi was a middle-level car, and DKW was kind of the bargain basement level car. I like this car because, one, the engineering is very nice. The other thing I like about this car is really, except for new tires and some mechanical work, it's totally original. It's never been painted, the interior's never been done. When I went to look at the car in Charlotte, and the guy was showing me the car and we were driving it around, I was trying to find a fault with it. And I'm like, the radio doesn't work. Turn the radio on, it's an AM radio. I go, the radio doesn't work. He's like, no, no, no. You have to wait a minute for it to warm up and then it comes on. It came on. Because in my era, you never had to wait for the radio to come on. So it's one of those old radios that has to warm up for a second. But although it was the lower line of Auto Union, it was really well engineered. It sold really well. They were very robust and reliable. And it has other really nice features. One is the way the doors are cut. When you open the door, there's a lot of room for your legs right here. So it's really easy just to sit down and slide your legs in. They also had, on the gas pedal, there is notches on the back of the gas pedal because people that bought these cars were into economy. So if you put a little bit of pressure on the gas pedal, you kind of get about half throttle. And then there's a little roll on the bottom of the gas pedal. You got to push a little bit harder to get more throttle so you don't always just mash the gas pedal to the floor. And that way you would get better economy. But it's unlike the SM, it's a really simple car. Except opening the hood. No, no, no. There we go. So you can see that the engine's right here, very small, 800 cc's. The radiator's right there. Again, front wheel drive. Again, just a really simple, elegant package. All right, next I'm going to go to the 1965 Matra Jet 5. I like this car because it's light, it's nimble, it's fairly fast, and I like it because of its history. It's got a neat history. Matra is a French aerospace company that has been around since the 40s. There was a guy named Rene Bonnet in 1960. He started a car company making sports cars, and he was really interested in racing, but he couldn't support racing without selling street cars, and so he started making a car very similar to this called the CBR1, which he tried to sell, and he wasn't able to sell in large enough numbers to really support his racing. So in 1965, Matra, being an aerospace company, were saying, nobody really knows who we are, but we do all these really neat things. We need to buy, they thought, if we buy a car company and go car racing, then we'll have some brand recognition. And so that's what they did. They bought Rene Bonnet's business in 1965. This is essentially a slightly changed CBR1, so it's very similar to a CBR1. It's a Renault powered. It has Renault brakes on it, but the Matra Jet 5 is famous for one thing. It was the first mid-engine production car ever made. The Lamborghini Miura came out like 6 months after this, so this has the influence of that. But Matra went on to make other road cars, and they were very successful in racing. They won the Formula One World Championship in 1968 or 1969, I can't remember. They also won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So once they started getting into cars, because they had the technology too. They were a very technology-oriented company. And so they were very successful in racing, but they stopped racing in the mid-70s. They decided, well, okay, we got our notoriety, everybody knows who we are now, we don't need to do any more racing. They continued to build cars after that in very low volume, and then they started building minivans or vans for Renault, the Aventine, which they just stopped doing that in the last couple of years. So really the Matra car division has now disappeared. The aerospace company still exists and is still in business. But again, it's just it's a really nice handling, well done, fun car that fiberglass body, single tube down frame. And they were very successful at Le Mans and many other places in the 60s. These were very competitive cars on this race circuit. One of my favorite cars, Fiat 500. So the 500 was the Italian people's car, made from 1957 to 1975. Almost every country had its people car, at least every populace. We had the Model T, England had the Mini, France had the 2CV. the Fiat was the people's car. They were really robust and they were really cheap, but they were really well engineered and they were very durable. I have an Italian friend that told me when he was in high school, when they would go skiing in the French Alps, he and his 3 buddies would go in one of these with their skis on the top, which is kind of amazing because it's fairly big, but it's not gigantic. And I don't know who fought for the back seats, but hopefully they put the smaller people in there. But it's one of those cars, top speed's about 60 miles an hour. You know, it handles really well. You can park it almost anywhere, and it's super, super reliable. And during the production run, they sold about 3.5 million Fiat 500s. It evolved into the 126 after that, which was a slightly larger engine, a little different body. And of course, now we have the new Fiat 500, so they really kind of brought that back. But it was really a successful car for Fiat, just sold in tremendous numbers. I like this car because of the engineering and the way it drives, but also I had 2 really nice road trips that I did in this car. One I did in 1997, there was a microcar meet in Chicago, and I drove up there on Friday and went to the meet on Saturday and Sunday, and I drove back on Monday, and I won the distance award. Unfortunately, I was never into keeping awards in very good shape, and I turned this into a dog bowl for many years. It's amazing that it survived, but when I went to wash my car on Saturday morning at the meet before the show, they had a car wash area, like a hose in a bucket outside the hotel, and I'm the only one around washing their car. I'm like, wonder what's going on. They're like, you're the only person that drove your car. Everyone else trailered their car, even if they lived 20 miles away. But it's really, you know, you can drive it on the freeway, and busy freeways, it's not a lot of fun because you're kind of in the way, but you know, when the freeways aren't real busy, it's not so bad. The other fun trip I had is with my beautiful wife, who's right there. We did Route 66 3 years ago. We did from Santa Monica Pier to Chicago in 12 days, I think it was, with a group of about 10 microcars. And that was really a lot of fun. Lots and lots of stories about that. I wrote an article about it in the newsletter 3 or 4 years ago, which is kind of funny to read. But an interesting tidbit is, as we left LA early in the morning, you go through about 1,000 red lights. I'd say about 20 miles of just red light, red light, red light. And we had these pair of cyclists that were cycling beside us. They were obviously on a trip too. They had bags on their bicycles and everything. And until we couldn't shake them until we got out of the red light area, which was about an hour and a half or 2 hours. And so, you know, they'd be pedaling along. Of course, you know, you kind of really didn't accelerate fast because when you left one red light, you could see the next one up there. It was red, but we were talking to them a couple times. They said, you know, we really like the microcars. There's plenty of room for you and us on the road. So, but our average speed after the first day, somebody had a GPS and it was like 8.5 miles an hour. So it was a long trip. And part of the problem with that was with 10 microcars, somebody was always broke down. And so you would stop and hopefully if you could fix their car in a half hour, then we'd do that. If their car was really bad, then you know, you'd put it on, they would be on the trailer for the day, but they were very long hours. So, but it's just a great car to drive, even today. It's fun. So my last car is the one of a kind, 1955 Guadalupe. I just like this car. It's kind of like the scooter car. It's totally outrageous. A guy named Guadalupe built this for himself and apparently drove it around for years and years. If you look at the mechanicals over here, he kind of got an engine from somewhere and a transmission from somewhere else, kind of hooked it all together. Actually, the engineering on it's quite good. You know, it has a sway bar in the front and everything. And he put the engine in the middle. So really, although we haven't had it running yet, it probably handles real well. But the thing you always have to wonder about is, you know, if you're sitting here on a warm day and the motor's right there, it's got to be warm and it's got to be loud. So. But it's just one of those quirky one-off cars that really I think is very interesting. All right. Any questions? All right. Appreciate everyone coming out. Thank you.